Some men don't die from bullets. They die from silence, from the things they never said, from the moments they didn't face when they should have. James Mallister knew that feeling better than most. It had been 10 years since he last heard his name spoken with any weight. The world didn't ask if he was alive. It simply marched on. Once, he had a home, a family, a future. Now, his mornings began with dust, the broken boards of fences, and the lonely clatter of horseshoes on dry earth. That morning, James wasn't looking for trouble. He was inspecting a fence line along the northern ridge of his Montana ranch, axe over shoulder, squinting through the sun that made the prairie shimmer like heat waves on glass. Then he saw it, a small burlap sack dangling from the low limb of a crooked cottonwood, swaying lazily in the breeze. The kind of thing a man ignores if he's smart, but something about it felt wrong. Too still, too quiet. And when James approached, squinting under the brim of his weathered hat, he heard it, faint, ragged breathing. He dismounted slowly, boots sinking into dry earth, and tugged the sack free. Inside was a young woman, no older than 25. Her dress was torn, dust clinging to the fabric, and her skin, lips cracked, wrists bruised and bound by rusted wire. She didn't cry, didn't plead. She simply whispered, "Just make it quick." James froze. He knelt beside her, lifting the ragged cloth just enough to see her face. There was exhaustion there, yes, but also something more. The kind of brokenness that's been forged in fire, not misfortune. Her eyes were green, but dull, like a storm-clouded river. The realization hit him like a blow. Someone wanted her erased. Not dead, not missing. Vanished, forgotten. The ranch behind him had never meant much to anyone. Dusty porch, 2 splintered chairs, a roof that moaned with every gust of wind. Yet for her, this was the first trace of safety she'd known in years. James didn't ask her name. He didn't probe for her story. Silence, he'd learned, sometimes spoke louder than questions. For the first week, she stayed in the corner near the stove, curling herself like a coil of rope, flinching at the hiss of the kettle, watching the door as though expecting it to burst open with every creak. She ate only when James offered food. She didn't speak, but she remained. That alone counted for something. James worked quietly, fixing fences, tending horses, repairing broken boards, his movements measured and deliberate. The quiet between them became its own language. A week passed. One morning, she stepped outside, hair tied back with a faded strip of cloth, shoulders stiff as if forcing herself to stand taller than the years of abuse allowed. Without a word, she picked up a log. James didn't stop her. Together, they chopped wood in silence. 2 shadows in the golden morning light, each carrying burdens they didn't voice. That night, she finally whispered one sentence. "You didn't hurt me." James didn't answer. She simply nodded once, and for the first time, she finished her meal, even smiled, small, cautious, but real. It was tempting to think this could be the start of a simple story. Healing, trust, second chances. But James knew better. In this world, the past doesn't wait. It began with hoofprints, deep, fresh tracks along the southern fence line, too heavy to belong to any neighbor or stray cattle. James noticed them at dawn, the sun barely cracking the horizon. He said nothing to her, checked his rifle, rode the border twice that day. That night, she moved closer to the fire than usual. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "Something's coming." Then she revealed the mark, burned into her inner wrist. Sloppy, jagged letters. H-A-K. James's stomach tightened. He had seen that mark before, on a drunken man outside Bisbee's saloon years ago, bragging loudly of deeds that should never be proud. Back then, James had looked away. Too smart to get involved in someone else's mess. But now, that mark made it his mess. The next morning, he rode to the nearest town, Helena, not to talk, but to listen. 3 women missing over the past 6 months. 2 from Texas Ridge, 1 from Santa Vale. Young girls, women barely out of their teens. No witnesses, no evidence. The sheriff shrugged. "Nothing we can do." James nodded, silent. Rode out. But something had shifted inside him. This wasn't about justice anymore. It was about her. That night, under the flicker of the oil lamp, she asked the question that had been unspoken for days. "Why did you go?" James didn't look up. Hands steady on the rifle barrel, he answered softly. Sometimes bad men need to know someone's still watching. Her hand brushed his, fleeting. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was recognition, a shared understanding, a second chance for both of them. And here's the truth. James wasn't a hero. He didn't ride in like a figure from a dime novel. He moved quietly, calculated, through dry creek beds and narrow canyons. Only locals, only coyotes knew these trails. He found the camp just after sundown. A ramshackle cabin leaned against a cliff, smoke curling lazily from the chimney. Laughter inside, rough voices that made his skin crawl. He tied his horse to a low branch and crept up the back trail, timing his approach to the rhythm of the men inside. The first man rose too fast, rifle butt meeting chest. Second man reached for a knife. James's bullet cracked through the air, shattering the lantern and bathing the room in sparks. Third dropped his blade before it even left the table. Silence swallowed the cabin. James grabbed her from the corner, wrapped her in his coat, and nodded once. No words, only action. Out they went. As they rode toward Helena, James's voice cut through the night softly. She's not yours, never was. And if I hear you touch another girl again, there won't be a second warning. They reached town. The sheriff looked ready to argue. James dropped the girl's blood-stained dress and the broken knife onto the desk. That was enough. This time law met justice. Back at the ranch, she didn't ask questions, didn't cry, just watched him, slowly, as if realizing not all men were cruel. And for the first time in years, James felt something he hadn't in a long time, standing for something. Days grew quieter. She tended the garden, brushed the horses without flinching, even hummed softly while sweeping the porch. James continued his chores, quietly observing, quietly healing. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, she asked, "Why did you come back for me?" James paused, considering, then said simply, "Because someone had to." And that was enough. "Now, I have to ask you something, friend. What would you do if someone came to your door, broken, asking for more than just shelter? Close it and pretend you didn't see? Or open it and maybe save a part of yourself in the process?" If this story is striking something deep in you, hit the like button. And if you want to see how James and her faced the shadows of the past, tap subscribe. The next part is coming, and it's about to get darker, faster, and even more dangerous. The night after Helena, the wind carried a sharp chill, even for Montana. James Mallister sat on the porch of his ranch, rifle across his knees, eyes scanning the horizon. The girl, now starting to answer to Clara, crouched near the fire inside, her green eyes glowing in the flicker of the oil lamp. She hadn't spoken since that morning ride back from town, but her presence was enough. Silence was no longer empty, it was loaded, waiting. James had thought rescuing her would be the hardest part, but out here, the hardest part was surviving the echoes of choices made long ago. The hoofbeats came just before dawn. Slow, deliberate, careful, not from town, not stray cattle. He knew the pattern now. Whoever had left Clara on the northern ridge wasn't finished. By the time the sun bled over the eastern hills, James had tied the horses, checked the rifles, and left Clara in the cabin with a simple instruction. Stay inside, no matter what you hear. She didn't protest, didn't ask. She simply nodded, eyes wide but steady. The trail led him into the canyon south of the ranch. Narrow, jagged, carved by decades of river and wind. Smoke curled faintly over the ridge ahead. Laughter, low, crude, the kind that made his blood run cold. He crept closer. A shack leaned at a precarious angle against a cliff face. Shadows danced inside. He counted 3 men through the slats, at least 3, maybe more. One laughed too loud, one swore too sharp, one kept eyeing the door, expecting trouble. James moved like a ghost, rifle ready, every sense tuned to the faintest sound. This wasn't a storybook hero riding in for glory. This was a man who had seen death, carried its weight, and knew patience could save more lives than bullets sometimes. When the first man leaned too far from the door, James's rifle cracked through the morning air. The butt slammed square into his chest before he could cry out. The second reached for a knife, James's shot shattered the lantern, sparks flying, smoke choking the room. Silence fell. Inside, Clara crouched, frozen, barely breathing. He covered her with his coat, a shield and promise in one. Outside, the world seemed to pause. The men had no words, no defenses, just a sudden recognition that they weren't in control anymore. Not yours. Never was, James said quietly, voice low but carrying weight. And if I hear about another girl disappearing because of you, you won't get a second warning. He guided Clara down the canyon trail, careful, steady, making sure she felt safe, even when danger still lingered in the shadows. Back at the ranch, she didn't ask for explanations, didn't cry. She simply stood by the gate, watching him, beginning to trust that not all men were monsters. For days, life was cautious. Clara helped with chores, tended the garden, swept the porch, fed the horses. She spoke rarely, but her silence now felt like conversation. The first morning she offered him a cup of coffee. He didn't speak, just accepted. A second cup, a pair of boots by the door. Small signs, but to James, they meant she was healing. But peace doesn't last long when the past has teeth. It came in whispers first, from travelers passing through. A rumor of girls missing along the northern routes. Townsfolk speaking in half sentences, glancing over shoulders. Then Clara noticed shadows moving at the edges of the property, just out of sight. One evening, she finally spoke, voice trembling but resolute. They're watching again. James felt it too. The weight of eyes he couldn't see. The world had a way of finding those who thought they were safe. He saddled the horses and rode the perimeter, rifle resting on his knee. Every shadow could be a threat. Every wind gust might carry a lie. 2 days later, he tracked the men's movements to a makeshift camp near Dry Creek. Hidden among the rocks, smoke rising in faint blue curls. Inside, girls, Clara's age, younger, some barely women, all frightened. The sight hardened James's resolve. He waited, nights under the stars, rifle across his lap, listening to the soft whispers of the prairie. Timing was everything. A single misstep, one premature shot, could cost lives. When the moment came, he struck, not with rage, but precision. A warning shot through the lantern, shadows thrown across the walls, men scrambling blindly. James grabbed Clara first, shielding her with his body, guiding her out of the chaos. The men were left with one message. She's not yours. She never was. And I'm watching now. Back in Helena, he delivered the girls to the sheriff. This time, Lar answered, but only because James made sure of it. No argument, no pleading, evidence, proof. The missing girls were safe, at least for now. Returning home, Clara didn't cry, didn't ask for details. She simply watched him, standing at the gate, realizing the world wasn't entirely cruel. And James, for the first time in a decade, felt he had done something that mattered. Not for himself, not for recognition, but because it was the right thing. Days passed. Routine returned, though shadows lingered. Clara hummed while brushing the horses. She tended the garden, even asked about planting new herbs. She still slept in her room across the hall, not beside him. That was enough. One evening, under the vast Montana sky, she asked softly, "Why did you go back for the others?" James thought for a long moment, then quietly, "Because someone had to, and someone needed to see they mattered." It was enough. But a man like James knew better than anyone, the past isn't gone. It waits, patient, watching for the unprepared. And just when the prairie seemed calm, a shadow moved again at the edge of the property. A single rider, dust trailing behind. A warning that the story wasn't over. Here's where you come in, friend. Do you keep watching when justice seems slow? Or turn away when the shadows get close? If you're still with me, tap the like button. If you want to see how James and Clara face the next storm, the one that could take everything they've rebuilt, hit subscribe. The next part is coming, and it's where the past finally catches up. The stakes become deadly, and the truths long buried will surface. The morning broke over Montana with the sky bruised in purple and gold. James Mallister stood on the ridge, rifle resting on the rail of the porch. Clara appeared behind him, her hair caught in the light, her green eyes alert but calm. Do you think they'll come back? She asked softly. James didn't answer immediately. He'd been down this road before. The quiet before a storm is never empty. They always do, he said at last. But we won't be the same people we were last time. The ridge below stirred. Dust on the horizon, faint hoofbeats. Not one, but two riders. James signaled Clara to the cabin. She didn't move until he nodded, then slipped inside quietly, like a shadow herself. James saddled his horse, hands steady, but his mind racing. This wasn't just a raid. This was a reckoning. A reckoning for the years he'd walked silently past the wrongs of the world. For the girls left missing. For Clara. For every injustice he had seen and done nothing about. He rode out, quiet, through the canyon paths only locals and coyotes knew. The two riders were easy to track, dust spiraling behind them in the rising sun. They led him to a hidden camp, more fortified this time, built against the cliffs, smoke rising lazily. The laughter, coarse and cruel, echoed off the stone walls. James dismounted, rifle ready, surveying the camp. 3 men, heavily, armed, younger than he expected, but hardened. The leader, broad-shouldered, a crooked scar across his jaw, spat on the ground as he saw James approach. "Well, if it ain't the ghost of Helena riding out of the mist," the man sneered. James's hand rested on the rifle. His voice was calm, low, carrying the weight of years. "This ends today. Nobody else disappears." The men laughed. That was the mistake. The first shot wasn't meant to kill. It shattered the lantern near their fire, sparks flying, smoke curling. Chaos erupted. James moved like a storm, precise and unrelenting. Every motion calculated, every step protecting Clara and the other girls hidden in the camp. One man drew his gun. James fired. Warning shot. No hesitation. The others scattered, fear replacing bravado. He didn't give them a chance to recover. He moved fast, dragging Clara out from the shadows of the cabin, covering her with his coat as he had before. "You're not theirs," James said, voice steady. "Not now. Not ever." The leader lunged, knife in hand, desperation in his eyes. James sidestepped, grabbed him, and disarmed him with a swift motion learned from years on horseback and in fights that mattered. When the dust settled, the girls were free. The men lay defeated, too scared to move. Justice, finally, had arrived not through courts, but through courage and action. Back in Helena, James turned over the culprits to the sheriff. Evidence laid bare. Witnesses testified. This time, the law worked. This time, justice wasn't delayed. At the ranch, Clara didn't need answers. She didn't need promises. She just watched him, standing by the gate, realizing that not all men were monsters. And James, for the first time in over a decade, felt whole. Not because the world had been fixed, but because he had chosen to stand. Days turned into weeks. Clara tended the garden, brushed the horses without flinching, and even began humming while sweeping the porch. James continued with the ranch work. They still slept in separate rooms. That was enough. Peace was measured in small victories, not grand gestures. One evening, under the deep purple Montana sky, Clara approached him as he mended a fence. "Why did you keep coming back for them? For me?" James paused, hands on the rail, eyes on hers. Then he said softly, "Because someone had to. Because someone needed to see they mattered. And because I finally realized I couldn't live with silence anymore." She nodded, small and knowing. That was all they needed. And in that quiet moment, the wind carried a promise. Healing is slow. Forgiveness is slower. But both are possible when someone chooses to act. Weeks later, Clara finally slept without fear. She ate with James at the table, side by side, not touching, not needing to, just present. Small signs, but enough. One night, she handed him a small worn journal she had kept hidden. Inside, the names of girls she'd known, who had vanished before her. She handed it to him silently, a trust placed in his hands. James felt the weight of it, not as a burden, but as a responsibility. He would continue. He would fight the shadows. And he would teach Clara and anyone who came into their world that courage wasn't about glory. It was about standing when the world moved on. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the prairie gold and crimson. They stood by the fence, side by side, silent but together. The world was still cruel, still dangerous, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like they had carved out a small piece of safety. Clara finally spoke, her voice soft. "Why do you keep doing it? Coming back?" James smiled faintly, brushing a hand through the dust and sweat of the day. "Because someone had to, and because sometimes the world needs quiet men to do loud things." The stars emerged, one by one, as if witnessing a promise made and kept. And in that quiet, James Mallister finally exhaled. He had faced the past, saved lives, and in doing so, saved himself. Now I want to ask you, friend, what would you do if the world showed you someone who needed you? Would you turn away? Or would you stay, even when it's hard? If this story struck something deep in you, hit the like button. And if you want to witness more stories of courage, redemption, and the quiet power of standing for what's right, subscribe now. The West has many tales, some dark, some hopeful, and some still waiting for someone brave enough to tell them. Because sometimes, even in the wildest places, people find their way home.